Welcome to Library Seminars, a NOAA Central Library educational platform for the presentation of research and ideas in support of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's mission. Today's presentation is the second in a four-part series sponsored by NOAA's Office of Performance, Risk, and Social Science that focuses on climate equity and environmental justice. Their chief economist, Dr. Monica Grasso, will introduce today's two speakers. But before I hand over the mic to her, here are a few housekeeping items for your consideration. If you have trouble with the audio or the visual components of GoToWebinar, we suggest that you log out and rejoin us. This resets the software and usually resolves most technical issues. Our presentation is being recorded and will be available on the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel later today. I've added a link to the chat box. Audience members are muted. However, we highly encourage you to ask questions, so please feel free to type them in the questions chat box located in the control panel. And you can add those questions throughout the presentations. Let us know to whom the question is addressed by indicating the name of the person you'd like to answer it. And all questions will be answered at the end of the two presentations. So with that last detail, let's get started. The mic's all yours, Monica.
Thanks, Lisa. Very happy to be here. And as Lisa mentioned, today's presentations are the second from a series of webinars NOAA is holding on climate equity and environmental justice. This January, President Biden signed executive order on advancing equity and support for underserved communities, calling for all federal agencies to assess whether underserved communities and their members face systematic barriers in assessing the agency's service, and also to produce a plan to address these barriers. So with the spirit of advancing the NOAA's climate equity and environmental justice, the Performance, Risk, and Social Science Office is partnering with the NOAA Central Library to discuss the concepts of climate equity and environmental justice, and to examine how NOAA may better serve vulnerable and underserved communities. Our goal with this seminar is to share leading edge social science and foster productive collaboration. So, and before I introduce our first speaker, I also like to take this opportunity to announce the We Are NOAA Week on July 26th to the 30th. This will be a week-long campaign to highlight NOAA's service and underrepresented voices, aimed to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, both internally and in supporting underserved communities. And finally, I'd like to thank our amazing speakers here today. We have David from Australia. It's very early there. Thank you so much, David, and Michael, and also to the NOAA Library, especially to Lisa Clark for helping us with the seminar logistics. So our first speaker is David Sloberg, and he is a professor of environmental politics in the Department of International Relations of the University of Sydney and director of the Sydney Environmental Institute. His work focuses on contemporary environmental justice movements, environment and everyday life, and climate adaptation planning and policy. He's known internationally for his work in environmental politics, environmental movements, and political theory. So I'll pass to David.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me. I do want to start, as we normally do here in Australia, by acknowledging that I am on the unceded stolen land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's on their land that I both live and work at the University of Sydney. Look, I just want to give a little bit of background. Yeah, I'm mainly a political theorist and social movement theorist who's been working on this question of environmental justice for the last 30 years or so. as well as related ideas, climate justice, energy justice, food justice, and most recently on multi-species justice. And really, my focus has been on this concept of justice, and not necessarily from a theoretical perspective only, but how is it that the public understands the concern, and communities and activists? What do they mean when they say justice? What does environmental justice mean in movements, climate justice? Again, not just from an academic perspective, but from those that use the term. And as you'll see, most of my work is about the plurality of those definitions. But as Monica said, I also do some applied work, and I have done quite a bit of research, and teams of mine have done research with the City of Sydney recently on their adaptation policy, in particular on community engagement around what people want for engagement with Resilient Sydney, part of the Rockefeller program, doing research on people's experiences of shock events, shock climate events, flooding and bushfires and heat waves. And I'm currently doing some work on food security and food justice around the City of Sydney. So that's really all just to say that my own interests and focus around environmental justice and climate justice isn't at all around questions of mitigation or fossil fuel use. It's really about the experience and meaning of environmental justice and climate justice, and the planning that's necessary to adapt and to live more just lives in the midst of the ongoing stresses and shocks of a climate changed and a climate challenged world. So I want to cover a number of topics in the next 23 minutes or so. I want to give an overview of some conceptions and meanings of environmental justice. Again, one of the central concerns of my work over the last 30 years has been about what justice actually means to movements. And I developed a framework, geez, almost 20 years ago, that is pretty widely used in the field. It was mentioned by Dr. Eisenhower in your first session. And when I watched that, I realized instead of giving a presentation specifically on the adaptation of the resilience work, that I'd go back and talk a bit more thoroughly about that framework. The second thing I want to do, though, is apply that framework a bit more to climate justice and talk about some of the differences between some of the academic and activist definitions of climate justice. And then I'll go and talk a little bit about how you actually apply that, how we've applied that in adaptation planning. So the first thing is really that how environmental justice activists have long understood environmental justice, and I've laid this out in 4 key ways. And people continually and constantly talk about environmental equity, but from the beginning of the environmental justice movement, it has not just been about equity. Justice has been about issues of recognition and racism. It's been about political participation and procedural justice, and it's been more broadly about capabilities. And I'll talk about what each of those mean. So on the equity question, I think I can spend less time on this. Obviously, the idea of environmental justice originated because poor people and people of color in the US are consistently exposed to more environmental bads than rich white folks. This is the cover of the 1987 United Church of Christ study on the inequity in the location of hazardous waste in the US. This kind of work was replicated over the years time and time again to demonstrate inequity in the distribution of a range of environmental hazards. There's also inequity in the distribution of environmental goods, public transit, parks, access to wilderness, and all of that. And there's environmental inequity in environmental governance, in protection from the state. So an early study in the 1990s showed the EPA had larger fines and stricter cleanup rules in rich white communities than they did in poor black ones. So environmental justice was initially all about those kinds of inequities and inequalities. So it gets to a very standard definition of justice as a distributive issue, who gets what. And that focus on inequity is at the heart of environmental justice. It's repeated globally. It's one of the key reasons why we do see environmental justice broadly accepted across the world as a concept. But it's never been the only way to think about that concept of justice, either theoretically or in practice. For some for most, actually, the question isn't, do we have distributional injustice? The question is, how do we get to this point? How is inequality created? How is that unequal distribution produced in the first place? And that's why at the outset and constantly we see demands for environmental and climate justice articulated as demands for recognition and respect. This is why you see demands or links with environmental racism. It's why indigenous nations articulate the reasons for the desecration and destruction of lands and cultures as a form of racism. It gets at the demands for climate justice from vulnerable and small island states and developing nations based on the fact that their needs, their vulnerabilities, their cultures are simply not respected, not paid attention to. I do think it's important to note theoretically that there are different ways of understanding this concept of recognition. There is both a psychological and a status-based one, and we see this both articulated in the movements. For some theorists, this idea of recognition is a basic human need, that we need to be recognized by others to be disrespected, gets our self-worth. We feel less human when we're not recognized. And I'm sure Mike has plenty of stories of this as well, but you see this all the time in public conversations and public hearings in environmental justice, where women are disrespected, where women or Black women are called by their first name while white men have their entire name used. And it's that kind of sort of very subtle disrespect. There's body language that you see all the time in public hearings where people won't listen to activists, or they turn and talk to one another, whereas when white lawyers get up, they'll be at full attention. That sort of practice of just everyday misrecognition, that disrespect at the individual level, is an everyday experience for activists, and authentic recognition and inclusion is a key part of the demand for justice. But obviously, that sort of psychological impact isn't the only way of thinking about misrecognition. Others certainly see it as a collective and a structural and a status-based injustice that's based in cultural institutions, social institutions, and political institutions. So Nancy Fraser, for example, talks about 3 different forms of status-based misrecognition. One is a practice of cultural domination. Another is a pattern of non-recognition or invisibility. And a third is this outright disrespect, being routinely maligned or disparaged in public and cultural representations. So racism and gender are clearly 2 forms of that status-based form of misrecognition. And it really is a focus on this institutionalized form of misrecognition, and not just the individual psychology. That's the focus of justice. So both of these things are articulated. And there are plenty of examples of this. I mean, this has long been an issue in civil rights movements. The whole idea of protests around I am a man starting in the 60s, that's come back up in Black Lives Matter. Just having to hold a sign that says I am a man or I am a human being in protest gets at that idea. It's all about misrecognition, malrecognition of people and communities. That status-based discrimination is at the core of indigenous environmental justice demands. It's about disrespect of culture, especially culture that takes place in the relationship between humans and plays seriously. The third obvious way of thinking about injustice is around participation and procedural justice. Look, I'm a political theorist. Democratic theorists have this thing called the all affected principle, which is a very straightforward idea that people should be involved in decisions and consulted in decisions that actually affect them. It's a basic tenet of democratic legitimacy. And without a doubt, this kind of political demand for political participation in decisions that govern communities have been essential for environmental justice from its inception. For environmental justice advocates and activists, a policy is simply unjust if the most impacted don't get a say. That's not a very radical statement, but it is a very common experience. And there's obviously a link between these ideas of justice, a lack of individual and cultural recognition, and the lack of valid participation, right? If you're not valued, you won't be invited into the process. So misrecognition due to racism, classism, gender divisions, creates real structural obstacles to political participation. And it's the same with inequity. Obviously, inequity in resource distribution makes you less able to fully participate in political decision making. So this demand for participation, this demand for a place at the table for equal informed participation has been at the center of environmental justice demands. Now, the final way of thinking about the notion of justice is a bit more complicated, but it really gets to the core of this sort of pluralistic notion of justice that we see in movements across the globe. It's a notion of justice that's based on capabilities or the basic functioning of life. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum developed a theory of justice that focuses on what it is that we need, the capabilities, the basic needs, to fully function in the lives that we choose for ourselves. So the central argument of a capabilities approach is that we should judge just arrangements, not simply in distributive terms, this sort of idea of equity, but more particularly in how those kinds of distributions affect our well-being and how those kinds of distributions are able to create a fully functioning or able to enable us to create a fully functioning life for ourselves. So capabilities are basic needs like food and shelter and health, basic rights like participation and control over our own environment. So there's a real focus and ethical significance on this idea of functioning, and injustice in this case is the various things that interrupt and limit that functioning. So how does that apply to environmental justice? Environmental justice activists have long talked about the basic needs and functioning of individuals and communities. It's always been about community health, about good jobs, about water that doesn't poison children. Environmental justice groups consistently talk about obstacles to community functioning. So issues of lead poisoning and asthma, for example, it's not just about the health of an individual person or child, though it is about that. But asthma in New York, for example, as Julie Z so brilliantly laid out, isn't just about the individual. It really is about the way that a community functions. It's the same with something like lead poisoning. I was involved when I lived in Arizona with a whole debacle that continues of a ski resort using reclaimed water, sewage water, to make snow on a sacred mountain that is offensive in so many ways, but it is basically a way to undermine the cultural reproduction of 17 different tribes that see that place as sacred. Navajo called this cultural genocide, and they don't use that term lightly, but it was the undermining of the ability of culture to reproduce itself. That's about functioning and the interruption of functioning. One of the things that I think is important here is this growing idea of attachment to place. And we hear about climate displacement all the time. We hear about migrations that will inevitably happen both in country and out. But one thing we need to pay more attention to is the way that climate change is disrupting us in place as well. We can have significant disruptions to our places without being displaced. And that kind of detachment in place is going to be a central and recurring experience of climate change. And I think we've seen this in the recent heat waves. And so the point is just to note that environmental justice has been understood in quite a variety of ways. Again, it's not just about inequity. It's about the lack of recognition and respect for vulnerable communities. It's about the lack of participation and inclusion, and the general lack and the undermining of the basic needs of life and the functioning of communities. And that's just 4 different ways of understanding environmental justice. There are others that go further than that. But what I want to turn to now is what that means for climate justice, because of course I developed this framework when I was thinking about and interviewing and talking with lots of folks in the environmental justice movement. But climate justice has also developed as a concept that has a variety of meanings. And what we get in the climate justice space is a bit more of a bifurcation between the academy, folks like me in environmental theory or environmental ethics, and the sort of continuation of those notions that I laid out previously from environmental justice into the climate justice movement. So the influence of environmental justice is clear, obviously, in climate justice movements, but the range of academic approaches include notions of historical responsibility. They include notions like a per capita equity approach or a climate egalitarianism. And then we have a whole series of notions of rights, of development rights, of using human rights to protect people, or the development of new environmental rights. That phase of climate justice is an attempt at applied philosophy or applied ethics. It's the use of more or less ideal notions of justice to try and provide a normative justification for climate change policy. The historical responsibility argument is quite straightforward. It's a polluter pays principle. Economists will be quite familiar with that. Responsibility for addressing the issue lies with those that have produced the problem and who can afford to right the wrong. And that's actually the approach that was brought into the UNFCCC, what was agreed to in this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities that was addressed back in 1992. That sort of historical responsibility approach that was agreed to then, that's been ignored since, really, is quite common in the environmental justice movement as well. The idea of cleanup and compensation for environmental damage is a recurring theme. Full compensation, reparations for damage. And in the climate justice movement, you hear this articulated as climate debt. When it comes to rights-based approaches, we hear a lot about a development rights approach, but I think the one that is most commonly used is a human rights approach. That's what's the basis of a number of lawsuits recently. And it's a very straightforward argument that came out of Simon Caney's work at Oxford, that climate change violates basic human rights of life, health, and subsistence, that the use of fossil fuels is unjust because it generates outcomes where people's fundamental interests are unprotected and undermined. And the reason why Caney developed this idea was obviously to get away from the need to develop a new agreement globally about climate change, and instead just go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which most nations had already agreed to. That climate change is simply a new way to violate basic human rights, and climate justice simply means providing for rights to which most nations have already agreed. And so we've seen that kind of rights-based approach taken up by movements, especially those that are, or it's used to as the basis of a number of lawsuits against companies and governments. But there has been a bit of a disconnect between those sort of ideal notions of climate justice, even those pragmatic attempts at applied theory that the movement has taken up, and more grassroots articulations. And I think the key there is that climate justice movements really did focus on the fossil fuel industry. In the last few years, this sort of keep it in the ground idea that 350 has developed has sort of taken off, but it's been there since 2002. It's a 20-year-old demand that goes back to the Bali principles of climate justice. There's been quite a network of climate justice organizations building around the COP meetings. Like I said, back in 2002 in Bali, in 2009 in Copenhagen, there was developed probably the largest statement of the movement, the Declaration of the Climate Forum. And it really focused on four basic things. It's on abandoning fossil fuels, leaving them in the ground. It's about financial transfers from the north to the south, an idea of paying for historical debt. It's about food and land sovereignty, and it's about a critique of market-based policies to address climate change. So all of these sorts of themes, that fossil fuel transition, financial support, moving beyond the market, addressing vulnerable communities, keep finding their way not just into demands for climate justice, but this is what we see more and more around the world, here in Australia as well, in demands to federal and state and local policy levels. But let me turn to the question of adaptation, because most of the academic work that's done around climate justice and most of the movement work that's been done around climate justice really does focus on the mitigation side of things. And I think it's absolutely crucial to talk about climate justice in terms of adaptation. And environmental justice advocates from the very early days have been quite concerned with obviously with the inequitable impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities, health impacts from heat, which we've seen recently, air pollution, which we have every time there's a fire, increasing storms, climate-induced disasters going back to Hurricane Katrina. And one of the main focus areas of environmental justice advocates has been the potential of this broad range of inequities that exist being exacerbated by climate change. And adaptation has been a way to sort of bridge environmental justice, climate justice, and social justice for vulnerable more generally in the development of transition and adaptation policies. So a justice-based conception of adaptation also moves beyond distributive conceptions of justice. There's a lot of focus on participation, on impacts of culture, and most strongly on those capabilities that communities need to continue to function. And I think here in particular, capabilities has really been an important way to understand and encompass the full range of concerns. In a lot of discussions of vulnerability to climate change and just adaptation, we see this focus on a range of basic needs, on health, on housing, on food security, on transportation, on culture, and social cohesion. And I've seen this in the demands for adaptation planning at the local level as well. And I'll close with that because this was a real sort of eye-opening experience for policymakers here in Sydney, as well as myself. And it was a question of different approaches to adaptation planning. So when the city of Sydney started doing its adaptation planning, it was focused on a pretty straightforward risk mitigation approach and a liability approach. So what are the risks out there and what will they cost us to fix? And so, of course, they hired one of the big four, it was KPMG, who did a risk assessment of the city. And then they suggested policies that would help the city out of that. We inserted ourselves, a team of mine inserted ourselves into the process, and we did a 2.5-day deliberative democratic process. And one of the very first things that happened in that process was a switch from that risk assessment approach to a vulnerability and a justice approach. And this was done quite immediately and pretty strongly when a representative of the city of Sydney, aptly this week, put up a heat map of the city, a summertime heat map of the city. I described the heat risk to the city and the policy of planting trees to try and lower the temperature in the city. And the immediate reaction of people in this deliberative forum was, no, you take this map, you look at this, these people over here, they don't need any help. They live in rich areas, they have air conditioning. What you need to focus on is these two neighborhoods here, the social housing that's here, people who don't have air conditioning. So there's this immediate switch from this sort of overarching risk of heat to the communities that were specifically vulnerable. And we saw this again and again in the risks that were brought up by reps of the city or KPMG and the response of community members. It was about the differential vulnerability, not just the risk. So it was about that maldistribution in one way, but it really was about what is it that's undermining people's everyday life. They focused on issues of housing and food and health. And one of the other things that they brought in, and we can talk about this in questions, because it gets at doing justice beyond the human, is they ask questions about the flora and fauna of the city, something that was completely absent, that nature, that environment was completely absent from the way that the city had originally approached. And look, one of the things that came out of this, and I know my time is up, but one of the things that came out of this was a sense of inclusion and efficacy on the part of the public, because when the city published the policy, they outlined those policies that were either suggested or endorsed by this public panel. It's clearly marked there. And what they also got, what the city also got, other than giving that kind of sense of recognition and inclusion, is they got a broader legitimacy for the policy. So they were able to justify what were then fairly radical policies in response to climate change because the public had endorsed them or developed them, and so they had a much broader legitimacy to the policy process when they did that. So look, that's quite a bit to cover. So I went over, but just the plurality of notions of justice, and I'm happy to talk more about those in questions. It's about that relationship between environmental and climate justice, and a little difference, sort of getting into the academic side between academics and activists, and then it's also really about how we apply this in the policy process to questions of adaptation. So I've left an email address there. Actually, someone's already contacted me from the office. I'm always happy to respond. And thanks for your time and attention.
David, thank you so much for sharing with us all these important concepts. Now I'm gonna, our second speaker is Dr. Michael Mendez. He's an assistant professor in the School of Social Ecology and Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy at the University of California, Irvine. He served as the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot Faculty Fellow in Sustainable Studies and Associate Research Scientist at the Yale School of the Environment. Dr. Mendez has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors. And Dr. Mendez' award-winning book, Climate Change from the Streets, provides an urgent and timely analysis of the contentious politics of incorporating environmental justice into global climate change policy. So all yours, Dr. Mendez.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, David, for that great opportunity to speak to you about these issues of environmental justice, the historical perspective, the theories behind it, and sort of modern day approaches to climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So I'm going to be taking a lot of that great work that David has done, who I have admired his work over the years, and apply it to a real-world case study that's happening here in California, particularly focusing on extreme wildfire events and undocumented migrants and the impacts. So to begin with, when disasters like wildfires strike, it is often assumed they do not discriminate on the basis of race or social class of their victims. While disasters themselves may not discriminate, they are a product of human decision-making that often disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color, due to existing structural inequalities in society. So every part of a disaster, including vulnerabilities, preparedness, response, and rebuilding, is to some extent a social calculus. Therefore, the question of whose lives get priority before, during, and after disaster is critically important. In the United States, as governments confront the challenges of climate change and extreme wildfire events, they often fail to embrace and engage undocumented Latino and indigenous migrants who are especially vulnerable and stigmatized in society. They are disproportionately affected by racial discrimination, exploitation, economic hardships, less English proficiency and Spanish proficiency, and fear of deportation in their everyday lives, their pre-disaster marginalized status. Yet few studies examine the consequence of a disaster for undocumented migrants. There is a strong need to better analyze the social cultural context and processes that produce structural inequality for undocumented Latino and indigenous migrants, and how disasters can intensify existing inequalities. So I start this community engaged research with this idea that disaster risk reduction starts with the social integration of migrants. So as David was talking about issues of capability justice, and recognition justice, ensuring that these individuals are full and thriving members of society. If we really want to deal with disaster risk reduction, we need to understand that undocumented migrants have this pre-disaster marginalized status, and disaster only exacerbates existing inequality. So we need to be able to integrate migrants before disaster into our social safety network, our healthcare systems, our education, and all aspects to have that form of capabilities justice. This research that I'll be presenting is a continuation of recently published research that I did with my co-authors that are working with migrant rights groups and environmental justice groups. The first research that we did was focused on the Thomas wildfire in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, and we've had a lot of success in terms of presenting our findings to public policy audiences, policymakers in particular, at NOAA previously last year, as well as the United Nations Organization on Migration, as well as other state emergency management organizations and agencies within the state of California. And this research, we really highlight how undocumented migrants are rendered invisible in the context of public policy because of systemic racism and cultural norms of who is considered a worthy disaster victim. So in the remaining minutes I have, I'll provide a broad understanding of wildfire and inequality, the overview of wildfires and undocumented migrants in Sonoma County, which is our new study area, the disaster impacts to undocumented migrants, and then during the Q&A, I'll talk a little bit more about some policy recommendations. According to the recent proceedings of the National Academies, climate change is making wildfire seasons longer and more severe. On average, wildfires in the western United States burn 6 times the acreage they did 45 years ago. In California's Sierra Nevada, the frequency of wildfires since the 1970s has increased 256% as mountain snowpack melts earlier and the fire season extends year-round. Moreover, in places like Sonoma County, which many of you may be know of it as the county next to Napa, which is also known for the world-class wineries that they produce in Sonoma County. In this area, moreover, 15 of the 20 largest wildfires by acreage in California have occurred since 2000. And 5 of the most destructive and deadly wildfires in California have occurred in Sonoma County. And many of those just occurred last year in September and August. And it's important to note that these wildfires that are destructive and deadly can be classified as extreme wildfire events that are unpredictable, fast-moving, and don't follow traditional behaviors of your sort of, if you will, run-of-the-mill wildfires. Moreover, while climate scientists expect wildfires to become more frequent and severe, it is important to explore how some people and communities are more affected by these events than others. In California, while many of the fire-prone regions are largely populated by higher income groups, they also include hundreds of thousands of low-income individuals who lack the resources to prepare or recover from fire. These numbers will likely surge according to the California 4th Climate Assessment Report, which projects that the state's wildfire burn area may increase by 77% by the end of the century. The state of California, however, does not have a comprehensive analysis of wildfire risk based on social vulnerability. Such outcomes occurring during and after a wildfire may have major environmental justice implications, in that certain populations, due to their socioeconomic status, must live with the disproportionate share of environmental impacts and suffer the related public health and quality of life burdens. Moreover, in our research, we investigate how human identities such as gender, class, indigeneity, and immigration status intersect with wildfire disaster. As I mentioned before, Sonoma County has now become one of the key epicenters of extreme wildfires in the state of California. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the social vulnerability in Sonoma County. While media outlets across the country have focused news reports on the loss of coastal and hillside mansions and impacts to wealthy homeowners and farmers, the Sonoma extreme wildfires, however, not only destroyed expensive property and crops, but it also endangered the health and livelihoods of thousands of undocumented migrants. California is home to an estimated 2.5 million undocumented migrants. many of whom are farm workers or are employed in service jobs such as housekeeping and landscaping. In Sonoma County, undocumented individuals are estimated to account for more than 7% of the population, or over 32,000 people. While relief efforts in Sonoma fires have been largely praised as effective, migrant workers were especially impacted from the fire due to the loss of employment, the lack of evacuation information in their native language, confusion about eligibility for disaster relief services, and poor infrastructure and housing in immigrant communities. Undocumented migrants' socioeconomic situation is usually precarious. However, the wildfire disaster intensified their already difficult situation. The Sonoma fires revealed how undocumented migrants and those with seasonal work visas require special consideration in disaster planning. These individuals are often afraid to seek help and restitution during and after a wildfire for fear of deportation. Undocumented migrants are also unable to access disaster relief services because of language barriers and prohibition from accessing federal and some state disaster assistance programs. Governments in the region overlook the needs of low-income farm workers, Spanish and indigenous speakers, and immigrant families. Sonoma County is home to a growing indigenous Mexican population. It is estimated that 12,000 indigenous people from southern Mexico live and work in Sonoma County. Concentrated in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops and grapes, indigenous migrants perform an increasing amount of the arduous labor that contributes to the profitability and affordability of fresh fruits, vegetables, and wine. In particular, indigenous Mexicans people in Sonoma County are culturally and linguistically isolated. Many are illiterate and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native language, Mixteco, Triqui, Chatino, or Maya. It is important to note that indigenous Mexican people are not Hispanic or Latino, but indigenous. They are often homogenized with Latino communities. So now I'm going to switch over to identify and talk a little bit about the 4 key impacts that we saw in the Thomas wildfire and in this new research we're doing here in Sonoma County. The first major impact is this issue of language injustice. When the Sonoma fires started, the major extreme wildfires started in 2017, Sonoma County did not have anyone to do live translations in Spanish, let alone in commonly spoken indigenous languages. So often you think of California as being very progressive, particularly when it deals with the Latino community and indigenous communities as well. But here's an instance that many counties have not dedicated any resources early on before disaster happens to the most marginalized communities, most socially vulnerable, and the most stigmatized. So important information was not being translated in Spanish or commonly spoken indigenous languages that included emergency evacuation areas where these were hazardous areas due to the wildfire smoke and other types of hazard. Boil alerts were not provided. The AQ warnings were not provided, and other sheltering and disaster relief services were not being provided to these individuals. And just to reiterate, particularly in this area that has a lot of indigenous Mexican communities, that how different a language, indigenous language such as Mixtec is from Spanish. I'm going to play a quick audio file. So as you can hear, the language of Mixtec does not sound anything like Spanish, and the importance for these communities and counties and local, state, and federal governments to be culturally and linguistically sensitive to the needs of these communities. In response of this language of injustice, migrant rights and environmental justice groups had to do their own translations of this important information, either through social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp apps, which is a text messaging system that many of migrant communities use, and also their low power radio station to get this information in both Spanish and several indigenous languages. There was also key impacts to worker health and safety to farm workers, as we can see from this photo. In Sonoma County, one of the major crops that are harvested are wine grapes. And wine grapes are often harvested between the time of 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning. So you could imagine sort of the risk that individuals are occurring when they're doing harvesting in these wildfire disaster events that are happening not too far away. And so they're doing this in the middle of the night and full of smoke. So in the situation here is that individuals are being asked to enter into mandatory evacuation zones that are considered hazardous to the rest of the general population, but employers are getting special permits from the Agriculture Commissioner and the county government to allow these migrant farm workers to enter into these mandatory evacuation zones to harvest the wine grapes to protect them from smoke and ash. But oftentimes, particularly in 2017, these individuals were not provided N95 masks, respirator masks, or other protective equipment to help safeguard and protect their health and their lives during these wildfire events. There's also other economic and health impacts to these workers. Many of these workers often feel pressure to enter into these mandatory evacuation zones to continue to work because for fear of not being able to get work after a wildfire disaster. A lot of the employment is done through contractors, and they feel that they may get blacklisted if they do not come to work during these much needed events to harvest and safeguard the wine grapes. And also there's additional pressure. Many of these farm workers are undocumented. So by their very nature of being undocumented, they are not eligible for unemployment assistance if they lose their jobs or if they should get sick from working in the fields. And as you can imagine, there's various health impacts from not having the proper PPE or any follow-up health monitoring of these individuals working in these dangerous work sites. And here's one of the quotes that we have done with some migrant farm workers and working at one of the wineries in Sonoma County. And he told us, "Working conditions in the field remain difficult. There is no one who monitors whether or not what the law requires. Most field workers work for contractors, which means the jobs are temporary. They don't have benefits such as paid time off, holidays, or paid sick days. The protections do not exist. The protections that do exist are in place only because employers are afraid to get in trouble, not because they want to improve worker conditions." So there's a lot of power differentials and power dynamics that are going on during these disasters, such as wildfires. There's also impacts to domestic workers and service workers. For example, after a wildfire, there's a lot of debris and a lot of sludge that can happen after the rains come, and there's mudslides as well. And companies come in and start hiring temporary workers to help clean up some of this toxic mix of debris. But oftentimes these landscapers are not told what they're cleaning up, and of course oftentimes are not provided with the proper protective equipment that would safeguard them from some of the toxic material they're cleaning up. There's also impacts to domestic workers in the other region that we published on in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, and it was also posted by the Los Angeles Times here in California. There was a situation where a domestic worker was in a mandatory evacuation zone, and the fire was a few miles away, but it was still a mandatory evacuation zone. And her employer asked her to stay in the house and safeguard until the very last minute. And so she was stuck there for a couple of days because the fire was raging on for over 40 days. And when she finally did leave, and she informed her employer that the house was okay and she was leaving, the employer did not really ask about her health and well-being, but asked her to pick up a few things for her and bring them to her at a hotel where she was sheltering in place. Other issues is this idea of ineligibility for disaster relief funds because they're undocumented migrants. They're ineligible for federal FEMA disaster relief funds and some state federal disaster relief funds. So, and to fill this lack of a government response to help these individuals that are contributing to the economy and our society, several NGOs and the philanthropic community came together to create the first in the nation private disaster relief fund called the Undocu Fund. And it was established in October 2017. It raised over $10 million and aided over 6,000 families and $6 million in direct assistance to almost 1,900 families who lost homes, possessions, their things, and from the devastating wildfires in 2017 and again in August of 2020, just last year. So this Undocu Fund has been replicated into other parts of the United States and other parts of California and our other study site in Santa Barbara and Ventura County. They also have what's called the 805 Undocu Fund, which is mirrors this program. The Undocu Fund is also important because the idea of public charge and mixed household families. So we had situations under the Trump administration with FEMA that mixed households, these are households that at least one individual that's a legal US resident or US citizen, if there's one person that is one eligible resident, they're eligible for a federal disaster relief fund because they're US, they have a green card or they're US citizens, and they're eligible to access disaster FEMA relief fund for the entire household of the family, including undocumented family members. But under the Trump administration, many of you may know that the FEMA organizations under Homeland Security, which also houses ICE, the Immigration and Customs Agency. And under the Trump administration, some of the disaster relief fund had a very clear disclaimer that read that this information may be shared with the Homeland Security Agency. So there was fear that households that were eligible for disaster relief fund, they weren't accessing it for fear that their family members would eventually be identified and deported. And there's also broader impacts to the community and insecure households. Some of the government designated shelter sites were seen as being insensitive and unsecure for undocumented migrants. They felt that there was being surveillance by ICE and other police agencies that would enforce immigration laws. So some undocumented family members went several miles away to the coast, such as we see here in Bodega Bay, where they camped out until the smoke cleared. So to wrap up, I want to end with this idea of thinking beyond property values. Oftentimes FEMA and our disaster agencies is really prioritizing expensive property or homes in general over people. And moreover, our disaster risk and vulnerability mapping approaches also entrench that sort of inequality that renders undocumented migrants and other vulnerable communities like the homeless invisible. Current social vulnerability mapping and disaster policies render many minority and poor stigmatized communities invisible. As shown in our case study, migrant communities were among the most impacted during wildfires. Moreover, immigration status has received little attention in disaster vulnerability mapping research. Though a large proportion of disaster studies has considered race and ethnicity as a vulnerability factor, impacts experienced by migrants require an intersectional research approach. Current disaster policies also fail to account for the complex web of impacts caused by disasters, far beyond the destruction of property within the perimeter of the fire itself. For example, toxic smoke flows down from burning mountainsides, settling in densely populated valleys below, threatening outdoor workers. Lavish hillside mansions are destroyed or evacuated, leaving low-wage migrant gardeners, housekeepers, and caregivers unemployed. Tourism throughout the region shuts down, putting thousands of hotel workers out of work. From the loss of housing and infrastructure to the closure of schools and job sites, multiple regions are impacted beyond the footprint of the actual fire. For example, a low-income migrant family living outside a burn area who loses several weeks of wages without eligibility for assistance may be more negatively impacted than a high-income homeowner who lives within the fire risk zone, whose property is replaced by their homeowner's insurance policy, which also pays for hotel accommodations for them to stay in the interim. So to end, as we move forward to ensure more inclusive disaster planning, we need to draw on migrant, indigenous, and community knowledge and embrace migrant communities in disaster planning, response, and recovery. And most importantly, we need to bolster Latinx and indigenous NGOs and civil society organizations' capacity in disaster relief and planning efforts, as I've shown in the Sonoma County, as well as the Santa Barbara and Ventura County. Often NGOs, migrant rights, environmental justice organizations are seen as a stopgap measure, that they're filling in that government a gap, and government is really relying on civil society to fill in the gap of the role that government should be doing in the first place. So here we're advocating that governments need to not only provide more culturally and linguistically appropriate disaster policy that really factors in social vulnerability, including immigration status, but also work in partnership with these NGOs as well. And then finally, identifying that our disaster planning managers and infrastructure system is primarily a white male-led sort of agency and professional practice. As we see from the Scientific American recent article, one of the disaster secretaries for I believe this was the state of Virginia, really identifying that the lack of inclusivity in the workforce in the disaster field is really hampering our ability to engage in more robust, socially robust approaches to disaster planning. So here are some preliminary findings that we were seeing in the extreme wildfire, particularly from last year and the previous years, that there's an uneven implementation throughout the state of N95 masks implementation, particularly for farm workers that are being asked to enter into mandatory evacuation zones. The state has a rule that N95 masks have to be distributed when the AQI index, air quality index, reaches a point of 151, but we're seeing that that's really implemented unevenly. There's also improper monitoring of the air quality index in general. So these the air monitors, the government stationary monitors, are often measuring the air that are miles away from the work site these individuals are actually working on. So it doesn't really show a real-time a measurement of what is the working conditions, the air quality conditions that are actually happening in these vineyards. There's also no statewide guidance for implementation of worker health and safety during wildfires. And then again, these access verification permits that are being allowed to allow farm workers to enter into mandatory evacuation zones. There's no sort of guidance on that as well. Farmers have no emergency plans in place of how to get workers out of the work site if the conditions become too hazardous. There's no post-exposure health test for these workers, and there's no adequate field sanitation for the workers to wash themselves out, let alone go to the bathroom during these smoky conditions. And you can see how that's a compounding of a disaster, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, Cal OSHA, which is our Office of Occupational Health and Safety at the state level, has a really limited staff, and there's only 26 investigators, field workers that speak Spanish in the entire state of California. And again, we're a state of nearly 40 million people. There's only 26 field investigators that speak Spanish, and we have no statistics of any of them that are able to speak any of the indigenous languages that some of these farm workers speak. So I'll leave it at that point, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about some of these real-world issues that are happening in terms of disaster planning and climate adaptation. So thank you, and I look forward to the opportunity to engage in conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. And audience, we have let's give about 5 minutes for questions. So please type them in the questions chat box, which is located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And make sure to let us know if you're addressing a particular person. While we wait, actually go ahead and stop sharing your screen, Mike, so we can fill the screen with both your faces. We do have a question. And so David, this question is for you. And it asks, do you have any recommendations for NOAA to ensure that any federal programs, ensure the recognition, participation, and capabilities of underserved communities? Is it purely a local problem, or can a national level policy help? Also, are these injustice problems hazard specific, or can we follow a framework to better serve these communities across different climate disaster types?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things you can do at the national level is more mandating of public inclusion and public participation. I think this is a good question for Mike as well. I mean, when you look at a range, and it isn't just hazard specific, this is for a number of things. I mean, this is for heat waves, this is for flooding, this is for fires. When we're talking about adaptation, what we often see is if there's a federal mandate, as there was at one point here in Australia, that mandate is for for local government areas, for state governments to have a disaster plan or an adaptation plan, but it doesn't mandate the inclusion of all those who are affected. And this is why you get all the money going to the big four, KPMG or EY or something like that, for a risk assessment. And a risk assessment that doesn't include the knowledge of local people. And it's not just about justice, though it is that. It's about basic knowledge. I mean, the people that Mike is talking about, people on the ground, for example, and it's the same here in Australia. They have a particular kind of expertise, right? You can ground truth knowledge and knowledge claims that come from the federal government or from local governments on the ground. One example of that, and I'll just end here, Mike can probably answer the question as well, is when a policy was developed for cooling the city by planting trees, everybody thought, in the city and state governments thought this is a great idea, planting more trees to cool a city. But in the session that we ran with local residents, they said, well, yeah, except the trees that they're planting are varieties that drop large leaves. Those large leaves, when there's a rainstorm, block drainage. And so we have flooding on our street for the first time. And it's that kind of local knowledge, in addition to the basic idea of inclusion and the all affected principle, that's really crucial, right? And it's just the recognition isn't just recognition of difference, it's recognition of differential knowledge that can be applied to the solving of these problems. So yes, it goes across different types of hazards. And yes, it is something at the federal level can be mandated.
Excellent. Mike, did you want to take a stab at that question, or we have another question actually for you. So let me go ahead and, oops, we lost Michael. There we go. So this next question is for Mike. It says, did you find any social networks that Indigenous communities use that state and federal agencies can exploit for risk communion? Do you have recommendations for NOAA at the national level to reach these communities for wildfires across the country? And last but not least, how can NOAA work more closely with local NGOs and community leaders? Any recommendations from your research?
Yeah, there's several Indigenous organizations in California that are working directly with migrant communities, and they're becoming de facto disaster managers and disaster experts because they're forced into this position. Their main sort of mission has been focusing on immigration and labor issues, but this is where, again, like a lot of environmental justice issues are really intersecting with multiple types of problems. And they're advocating and they're forcing themselves through sharp elbows and advocacies and developing allies to force the county and state government and hopefully now federal government to really reach out to these communities ahead of a disaster. So again, I started off my slide that if you really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, you really need to focus on the social integration of migrant communities, particularly undocumented communities. Understanding that these individuals are rendered invisible, not because nobody knew or they're newly arrived. They've been here for decades, if not generations, working in this community, but they're rendered invisible in the context of public policy because political choices are being made that are intentionally withholding important resources and planning efforts to safeguard these communities before, during, and after disaster. So it's going to take government to really reach out and finding out what are the local community-based organizations out there that are serving the Latino indigenous communities in the state and in the regions that they work with. So it takes relationship building and working in partnership and ensuring that as FEMA in particular is building these grant programs and distributing aid, that they compensate some of these NGOs for some of the work that they're doing. I think that those are the key, and diversifying, as I mentioned before, the disaster planning managers at FEMA alone, the supervisors, 68% of them in a recent survey has been shown that they're white, and is not very reflective of the communities that are being hardest hit of disaster planning. And that when you don't have a diversified workforce as well at the federal level, state, or local level, you're going to be missing out on some of the key nuances of how to reach some of these communities most effectively. For example, like in Mixtec, when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, there was no word for virus. So they had to work, and the Mixtec language is largely oral, and there's many illiterate, there are some illiterate migrants that are Mixtec that don't speak English or Spanish, let alone read either of those languages. So ensuring that the information that you do is pictorial and is understand the cultural and linguistic sensitivities of the community that you're working with. And you can't lead it to just putting Google Translate buttons on there. And that did actually happen in Ventura and Santa Barbara County that has a huge Spanish-speaking population. They also, just like Sonoma, did not have any live translation. And they put Google Translate buttons. They put one word, one sentence in Spanish. If you cannot read this information, please take it to somebody that can translate it or use the Google app function, which was translating words like wildfire to Spanish hairbrush. So there's a lot of inequities there.
So interesting. Thank you for your response. This last question is for David. But before I read it out loud, I also want to read a compliment to you both at 2 outstanding presentations. Thank you very much. David, this last question asks, given the limited resources to address climate-related risks, does cost-benefit analysis play a role for allocating resources to mitigating risks faced by Sydney? If so, does the distribution of risks inform this analysis?
Look, I mean, I'm not going to say something that people don't know. The problem with cost-benefit analysis, if used improperly, is just that it doesn't include a lot of things that people value, and it doesn't value them in the same way that a community does. So, I mean, I think this was one of the things that the city realized in this large risk assessment that was done again by KPMG when they came in and had the list of risks, and then the policies that were recommended in order to address those. And of course, there was a cost-benefit analysis of those. The problem was that they hadn't covered the range of risks that actually existed in the city, and they hadn't costed those according to the values of a local community. I'll give 2 examples of that. Well, one I already gave is flora and fauna, right? So there's absolutely nothing in the risk assessment, and so absolutely nothing in the cost-benefit analysis about policies that would work to preserve parks in the city and the animals that live in parks. And of course, you know, in Sydney, across Australia, you've got some amazing native species that still come into the city. We've got bats, we've got a variety of parrots, we've got a range of marsupials, and it just was completely invisible. And this is something that residents in the city actually value, right? And so that was absent. The other thing is just, again, it's about this local knowledge. So there was absolutely nothing in the risk assessment about wind. And that sort of surprised residents, and residents said, well, what about wind? What about these windy parts of the area when storms come? And literally a few weeks after that assessment, of course, the risk assessors were shocked, and they hadn't done any cost or liability analysis of that. And a few weeks after these sessions, a major windstorm came out. High-rise buildings lost windows from high height. They came crashing down onto city streets. And the residents, of course, had understood that this can happen, right? But it wasn't picked up. So if you want to do a cost-benefit analysis, sure, but include the things that are actually important to local residents. Include the things that residents have an understanding about, and value them in the way that residents do.
Excellent. Thank you for your response. And that last question will conclude our presentation. Do either of you have any last comments before I end the program?
Just a thanks to Mike, and we really need to talk about disasters and some comparative work.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you, Monica, for this opportunity. And I know my contact information, if you want it, you can find me on the web. And I know they put some links into our research as well as our books as well. So I encourage you to check them out, or also contact us if you have any other information. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to conclude by thanking our speakers for sharing their research with us, and as well as Michael Smith and the Office of Performance Risk and Social Science for organizing this series. We do have another webinar coming up on July 13th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next webinar on the Climate Equity and Environmental Justice Seminar Series. And I just want to remind the crowd here that we are recording this webinar, and I will upload it, and it will be available later today on the NOAA Central Library channel. So please let other interested colleagues know about it if they could not join us today, or watch the first episode if you were not able to watch that webinar. Just to conclude, I'd like to say NOAA Central Library is very proud to host presentations like today's that feature the work of the NOAA community and its partners. So help us improve our programming by answering 5 quick questions at the end of this webinar. Thank you so much. And Mike, did you have it looked like you had something to say? No? Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.